After the murder of Emperor Maurice, Phocas, who had committed this deed, seized the imperial office. When he had assumed power, the situation of the Christians came to such a pitch of misfortune that it was commonly said that, while the Persians were injuring the Roman state from without, Phocas was doing worse damage within, wherefore the men who at that time were governing Libya, emboldened as they were by being so far away, they were two brothers, Heraclius and Gregorios, who had jointly been appointed to their military command by Maurice, made common counsel, and sent forth their sons to the city of Byzantium, on the understanding that the one who arrived first would take possession of the imperial office if he was able to do so. And after equipping a great fleet manned by Africans and Moors, they sent off at its head Heraclius, the son of Heraclius. As for Nikephoros, the son of Gregorios, they invested him with the command of a numerous force of cavalry and dispatched him by land. By good chance, Heraclius was carried by favourable winds, and, overtaking Nikephoros, sailed easily to Byzantium, where he reached shore in front of the city. Now Crispus, this man, who enjoyed great power in the palace, was Phocas's son-in-law, and at that time happened to occupy the post of city prefect, because he hated Phocas, by whom he had been insulted on account of the removal of his own image, which on one occasion the partisans of the competing colours had put up alongside that of Phocas, behaved treacherously toward him, and while he pretended to be striving on his behalf, and alleged that Heraclius had come to destroy him, yet he cooperated with Heraclius, and indeed helped him most actively. When therefore the men around Phocas saw how many citizens among them were rioting, for already the partisans of the green colour were setting fire to the surroundings of the house of Caesarius, and were proclaiming the newcomer emperor, and perceived that Heraclius's soldiers too were pressing upon them with great force, they abandoned Phocas and went home. Now a man called Photios, whom Phocas had once disgraced by seducing his wife, entered the palace with a throng of soldiers, and straightway arrested Phocas, whom he stripped of the imperial robes, and, after putting a black tunic on him, and tying his arms behind his back, cast him in a boat, and brought him prisoner to Heraclius. On seeing him, Heraclius said, "Is it thus, O wretch, that you have governed the state?" He answered, "No doubt you will govern it better." Immediately, while Phocas was still in the boat, Heraclius decreed that he be put to the sword, and then that he be mutilated, namely, that his right arm should be amputated at the shoulder joint, and his genitals be cut off, and these members be affixed to poles, and that his body should be dragged in this condition to the so-called marketplace of the Bull, and be consigned to the fire. He also ordered that Dementiolus, the brother of Phocas, Bonosos, and Leonidas, the imperial treasurer, should undergo the same penalty as Phocas. These matters, then, happened in this manner. Straightway, Sergius, the bishop of the city, and the rest of its inhabitants, received Heraclius within the walls with much gratitude. Now Heraclius urged Crispus to assume the imperial office, saying he had come not to take the empire, but to punish Phocas for his unlawful murder of Maurice and his children, but Crispus would not accept it. At length, Heraclius was proclaimed emperor by the Senate and the people, and was invested by the bishop with the imperial crown, and he appointed Crispus commander of the expeditionary forces in Cappadocia, and sent him thither. Since, however, a rumour was afoot that the Persians were mounting an expedition against the Romans, Heraclius went forth from Byzantium to meet Crispus at Caesarea, where he happened to be at the time. so as to take counsel with him concerning public affairs. Chryspos pretended to be ill, and lying down in the manner of an invalid, received the emperor, who paid frequent calls on him with displeasure and unwillingly. It was also reported that he railed at him. Heraclius understood the plot, but he bore the insult and bade his time. He decided meanwhile to have a more sincere conversation on the necessity of mutual striving on behalf of the state. But the other man, as if in mockery, said it was not proper for an emperor to abandon his palace and to be tarrying among distant armies. At this juncture a son was born to Emperor Heraclius, whom he named Constantine. At the same time, Nikephoros, who had the dignity of patrician, arrived at the imperial city. For this reason Heraclius returned to Byzantium and received Nikephoros with great honour and distinction, as much as he would his own brother and equal, as they had previously agreed when they were departing from Libya. Chryspos too came to Byzantium, so as to join in celebrating the arrival of Nikephoros. Now Heraclius pretended that he was about to purify his son in the sacred font, and would have him adopted by Chryspos. On this pretext Chryspos entered the palace. After assembling all the members of the Senate and the remaining people of the city, together with their bishop Sergius, Heraclius is reported to have asked them, "When a man insults an emperor, whom does he offend?" They answered, "He offends God, who has appointed the emperor," and he urged Chryspos also to express his honest opinion. The latter, not understanding the play that was being acted, said that a man convicted of such a daring deed should not even have the benefit of a lenient sentence. Then the emperor reminded him of his feigned illness at Caesarea, and how he thought of degrading the imperial dignity, and how he, Heraclius, had offered him the empire, and picking up a book, he struck him on the head, and then said to him, "You have not made a good son-in-law, how will you make a good friend?" And straightway he directed that his head should be shorn in the manner of a clergyman, and that the bishop should recite the customary prayers over the act of tonsure. He then went out to meet the soldiers of Chryspos, and said to them these exact words: "The Reverend Chryspos had you as his assistants until now, but today we make you the emperor's own servants." He ordered that they should receive the usual allowance, and should have first place among the military contingents. They assented with great pleasure, and acclaimed the emperor together with the rest of the crowd. After this, he confined Chryspos in the monastery of the Cora, as it is called, where he died within a year. Now Heraclius sent out as commanders in the post previously held by Chryspos his own brother Theodore, who held the second highest rank after that of emperor, which in the language of courtiers is habitually called Kuroplates, as well as Philippicus, the brother-in-law of Emperor Maurice, who at that time had his head shorn in the manner of a clergyman. Philippicus survived for a time, but then he died, and was consigned to burial in the very beautiful and venerable church he had built at Chrysopolis. A short time had gone by when the emperor's wife, Eudokia, was seized by the illness of epilepsy, and died. And while her body was being carried out to burial, and as usual, a great many people gathered for the spectacle, it happened that a girl, she was the servant of one of the citizens, leaned out from an upper floor, and spat unguardedly into the air. Her secretion landed on the splendid vestment in which the empress's corpse was enveloped, whereupon those taking part in the funeral became incensed. They apprehended the girl, and condemned her to death by fire, thus, in the manner of barbarians, attaching to the demise of the empress an unholy burial rite, sacrilegious men that they were. They also searched all around for the mistress of the servant girl, so as to inflict on her the same punishment. But she, doubtless sensing the danger, escaped, and was never seen again. Such were the events surrounding the palace. As to what happened elsewhere, here is an account of it. In a certain rural district, which village this was has not been recorded anywhere, there lived a man called Botulinus, who prided himself on his nobility, and was conspicuous by his riches. His rank was that which the Romans are wont to call candidatus. A neighbour of his, who was a widow, was distressed by their propinquity, for there was a dispute between them concerning the boundaries of their lands, and Botulinus ordered his slaves to make an armed attack on his neighbour, and these men dubbed to death one of the widow's sons. Taking up the blood-stained garment of her dead son, the woman came to Byzantium to see Heraklios, and catching sight of him in procession, she rushed in, and caught the bridle of his horse. Showing him her son's garment, she cried out to him, "May the same fate, O Emperor, befall your children, if you don't immediately avenge in a just manner the blood I am showing you." Some of the imperial bodyguard came forward to strike her, but the emperor stopped them, and ordered the woman not to dare come into his presence again, but to pursue the legal process at the time of his choosing. So the woman straightway went off, lamenting without having obtained justice. Some time passed, and the perpetrator of the murder, fearing that the woman would again appeal to the emperor on account of the killed man, followed her to Byzantium, and mingled among the members of the Demes. When the hippodrome races were being held, the emperor noticed her among the fans, and directed the city prefect to imprison the suspect. He then summoned the woman, and made a more thorough inquiry into the murder. He ordered that Botulinus should suffer at the hands of his slaves the same penalty as the man who had been killed, and that his slaves should likewise kill one another. Now Heraclius, after having his son, who was called both Heraclius and Constantine, for he had a double name, sanctified by the bishop in the holy bath, received him in his arms out of the sacred font, and straightway he invested him with the diadem and the other tokens of the imperial office, and so crowned him and declared him emperor. And he betrothed to him the daughter of the patrician Nikephoros, called Gregoria. Nikephoros became in this way so intimate with the emperor that the latter erected a gilded equestrian statue of him on top of some columns in the marketplace, which is called the Forum. So much for these matters. Now Chosroes, the king of Persia, collected a numerous army, and sent it against the Romans, after appointing Saitos commander of the Persian forces. This man came to Alexandria, which he took by main force, and he captured all of Egypt. He devastated the entire oriental part of the empire, taking many prisoners and killing others without any pity. Having done these things, he proceeded with his whole army against the city of Chalcedon, which he invested for a long time, and requested that the emperor should come and parley with him. Indeed, the emperor assented, and crossed over to meet him, surrounded by the imperial bodyguard and his retinue. Upon seeing him, Saitos rose from his seat, and prostrated himself on the ground to do obeisance, while the emperor addressed to him a greeting from the boat he was sailing in, and gave him gifts. Saitos spoke these words to him: "It would have been desirable, O Emperor, that the kings of the Romans and the Persians neither disagreed among themselves nor opposed each other in any way, but established friendship and concord with all willingness, for such a state of affairs has been most pleasant and enjoyable to men of old, as it is to all of us now, insomuch as it is conducive to a desirable and orderly life. This concord should be as profound as our empires are great, for we know that no other state will ever appear to rival these our empires. Indeed, it is not proper, given the possibility of strengthening our mutual good relations and friendship by exhibiting wisdom and prudence, that we should take up arms and unjustly injure each other to the detriment of our subjects. For what would be the consequence of that? If you choose concord and peace, each one of you will be the happiest of men, and will appear, as long as he lives, to be worthy of envy and admiration. Your toil will become painless, and your cares will yield to joy. If, on the other hand, you let go of this course, and choose to banish peace, a great boon though it may be, believing it to bring you no benefit, and take up mutual hostility and enmity instead, you will become responsible for many wars, a discordant and hateful action, with the natural result that you will undergo much sweat and toil, suffer many casualties, and expend an enormous amount of money. In a word, the effect of the war will be to bring you great distress. This you can see already from the terrible experiences and sufferings of the Roman land since my invasion of it. As a consequence, our states will be reduced to a wretched and miserable condition. In uttering these words, he swore that he would do his utmost for the Roman and Persian states to come to an agreement. He undertook to accomplish these things, and, by way of confirming his sworn statements, he added that they were also agreeable to Khosroes. If, therefore, you believe me, he said, you will immediately dispatch in my company your ambassadors, who will treat these matters with Khosroes. I am sure he will be persuaded by me, since he is also minded to make an accord with you, and to establish for all time a sure and inviolable peace. When Emperor Heraclius heard these things, pleased and charmed as he was by the appealing gentleness of the speech, he promised to act most readily and strenuously in all respects. His views on these matters were supported and approved by the high priest and the dignitaries. The ambassadors were chosen with all speed, namely Olympios, who held the office of Praetorian Prefect, Leontios, Prefect of the city, and Anastasios, who was entrusted with the administration of the property of the great church, which bears the name of Sophia, the divine Logos. Taking these men along, Cytos set out from Chalcedon and retreated towards the abode of the Persians. As long as he was on Roman soil, he treated the ambassadors honourably and took good care of them, but when he entered Persia, he put iron fetters on them and brought them captive to Khosroes. When Khosroes learned that Cytos had seen Heraclius and had honoured him like an emperor instead of killing him, for such was his hope and dream, he was greatly incensed and, finally, had Cytos flayed and made his skin into a bag, a painful and violent death. As for the Roman ambassadors, he separated them one from another and confined them to secure prisons, where they underwent great hardship. The emperor was greatly distressed and troubled by these things. In addition, a severe famine developed at that time in the state, for Egypt was no longer providing grain, as a result of which the imperial annone gave out. Furthermore, a plague fell on the inhabitants of the city, and a multitude died of it. On account of these circumstances, the emperor was overwhelmed by despondency and despair, and decided accordingly to depart to Libya. He sent thither an advance shipment of a great quantity of money, gold and silver and precious stones, which on its way was overtaken by a violent storm, and a good part of it sank in the waters of the sea. On becoming aware of these moves, some of the citizens tried to prevent them as best as they could. The archpriest, too, invited Heraclius to the church, and bound him there by an oath that he would not by any means abandon the imperial city. He yielded to them, and against his will, acquiesced in their views, while lamenting the misfortunes that were upon them. After a lapse of time, the chieftain of the Hunnic nation came to Byzantium in the company of his noblemen and bodyguards. and requested the emperor that he be initiated in the Christian faith. The latter received him gladly. The Roman noblemen became baptismal fathers of the Hunnic noblemen, and the wives of the former did the same to the spouses of the latter. After they had thus been initiated in things divine, the emperor presented them with imperial gifts and dignities, for he honoured their chief with the rank of patrician, and so dismissed him gracefully to the abode of the Huns. After this, the chief of the Avar nation too sent a message to Heraclius with a view to concluding a treaty. The latter was greatly pleased at this, and rewarded him with gifts. Furthermore, he sent ambassadors to him, namely the patrician Athanasius, and in addition Cosmas, who held the post of questor, as they call it, to make a statement of imperial policy. Putting on a mask of friendship, the Avar chief spoke to them wily and alluring words, pretending to be a friend of the Romans, and announced that he would meet the emperor so as to conclude a treaty. The ambassadors returned and reported to the emperor the man's friendly attitude. Greatly pleased at this, he decided to meet the Avar chief in the city of Heraclea, as had been agreed. He sent in advance some theatrical equipment and made preparations for chariot races to be held at the reception. He also brought along splendid vestments for the Khan and his companions. He then arrived at Salimbria and lodged there. 3 days later, the Khan arrived before Heraclea with a great throng of Avars. After picking among his followers a contingent of the bravest fighting men, he sent them to the overgrown and wooded heights overlooking the so-called Long Walls, and scattered them secretly in the bushy hills, so that, taking the emperor in the rear, they might encircle him, and make an easy prey of him and his retinue. Upon becoming aware of them, Heraclius, greatly astonished at this unexpected event, took off his purple robe, and putting on instead some mean and miserable clothes, so as to appear like an ordinary man to anyone he encountered, hiding furthermore his imperial crown under his arm, immediately turned to ignominious flight, and barely escaped to Byzantium. The Avars set out in hot pursuit, and reached the plain in front of the city that is called Hebdomon, where they encamped, spreading out from there as far as the bridge of the river Barbiscus. They grievously devastated the settlements that are there, and pitilessly slaughtered the Roman people. They also seized the imperial vestments, the theatrical equipment, and all the men who were transporting those items. After taking a great many captives, they carried them off to their own country. The total number amounted to 270,000 men, as was mutually confirmed by some of the prisoners who escaped. Now Heraclius, even though matters of state had come to such a sorry and abnormal pass, did not even take care to put his private affairs in order. Instead, he committed an unlawful deed, one that is forbidden by Roman custom, by contracting a marriage with his niece, Martina. She was the daughter of his sister Maria. Her father was Martinos, who was Maria's husband before Eutropios. Heraclius begot 2 sons by her, the first of whom was called Flavius, and the second Theodosius. Justice, however, proclaimed the unlawfulness of the deed by causing the elder to have a paralysed neck, which he could not turn in any direction, and depriving the younger of the sense of hearing. Indeed, he proved to be deaf. This unseemly marriage was strongly denounced at the chariot races, even by the partisans of the green colour and those of the opposing colour, who concurred and cooperated. Sergius, the archpriest of Byzantium, also put earnest pressure on him by letter and admonished him to repudiate his connection with this woman, but he excused himself as follows: "What you say is very well. The obligation you owe me as high priest and friend you have already paid. For the rest, the responsibility shall lie on me. During this period, the the plate of the churches was being sold and expended to raise tribute to the barbarians. Once again, Khosroes, the king of the Persians, made war on the Romans, having placed his army under the command of Cerberus, who devastated all of the eastern lands. This man seized in the holy places the life-giving relic of the Cross of Redemption, Modestos being at that time Bishop of Jerusalem. Finding himself troubled by both the Persians and the Avars, and the Roman state hard-pressed by famine and decimated by plague, Heraclius called in Sergius, the bishop of the city, along with the noblemen and the rest of the people, and placed his children in their care. He entrusted the administration of affairs to the patrician Bonos, and, setting out by way of the Black Sea, he attempted to invade Persia through Lazica. At this juncture, a son was born to him by his wife Martina, for he had taken her along, and he named him Heraclius. From Lazica, he sent gifts to the chieftain of the Turks, whom he urged to enter on an alliance against the Persians. The latter accepted the gifts and promised to be an ally. Heraclius was pleased at this and set forth in his direction, and he, on being informed of the emperor's presence, met him with a great multitude of Turks, and, dismounting from his horse, prostrated himself on the ground before the emperor, while his entire host did the same. On perceiving this exceedingly great honour, the emperor declared to him that if their friendship was steadfast, he could draw nigh even on horseback, and he called him his own son. Taking off the crown from his own head, he placed it on the Turk, and after serving a banquet, presented to him all the utensils of the table, as well as an imperial garment, and earrings adorned with pearls. He likewise decorated with his own hand the noblemen of the Turk's suite with similar earrings. Fearing, however, lest he suffer the same fate as with the Avar chief, and with a view to making the agreement more binding, he showed him the portrait of his daughter Eudokia, and said to him, God has joined us, and made you my son. Behold, this is my daughter, the Roman Augusta. If you espouse my cause, and help me against my enemies, I shall give her to you in marriage. The Turk was so struck by the beauty of the picture and its adornment that he fell in love with the person represented, and held fast to the alliance all the more. Straightway he delivered to the emperor a multitude of Turks under a commander. Taking these along, Heraclius invaded Persia and set about destroying cities and overturning the fire temples. In one of these temples it was discovered that Khosroes, making himself into a god, had put up his own picture on the ceiling, as if he were seated in heaven, and had fabricated stars, the sun, and the moon, and angels standing around him, and a mechanism for producing thunder and rain whenever he so wished. Upon seeing this abomination, Heraclius threw it down, and ground it into the dust. Now Khosroes, when he had heard all these things, and the fact that the Turks were fighting on the side of Heraclius, he made everything known to Cerberus in writing, and directed him to return from the Roman country with all speed, so as to ward off Heraclius, since he himself was unable to oppose the latter's numerous host. This letter was intercepted and delivered to Heraclius, who, after reading it, erased the contents and forged a different message to Cerberus, as if it were from Khosroes, whose seal he affixed to it. It ran as follows: The Roman Caesar has concluded an alliance with the Turks and has marched in as far as the country called Adurbadigan. I have sent an army against him, and have destroyed him along with the Turks, and the remainder have fled. Do not, therefore, depart from the Roman country, but go on investing Chalcedon, taking Roman captives, and devastating their land. On receipt of this letter, Cerberus continued the siege. The Avars, for their part, broke the treaty which Heraclius, before taking up arms against Persia, had confirmed by means of gifts. Indeed, He promised to pay them 200,000 solidi, and gave them as hostages one of his own sons, John by name, whom he had also called Atalarikos. He was a bastard born of a concubine, as well as his nephew Stephen, the son of his sister Maria and Eutropius, and furthermore another John, the son of the patrician Bonos, also a bastard son born of a concubine. So they took up arms and drew near the walls of Byzantium, and straightway they set fire to all the suburbs, dividing as it were between themselves the Thracian Bosphorus. The Persians destroyed the Asiatic part, while the Avars devastated the Thracian side, and they made a mutual agreement to capture Byzantium. Now the Avars constructed siege engines, namely wooden towers and tortoise shells, but when these machines approached the wall, a divine force undid them and destroyed the Avar soldiers who were inside. Furthermore, the Avars had brought along a multitude of Slavic allies, and gave them the following signal, namely, that when the latter saw pyres kindled by the forward wall of the Blacani, the one called Teron, they would immediately set out in their hollowed-out canoes, with a view to producing a mighty disturbance in the city by their sea-borne sortie, while the Avars, seizing this opportunity, would climb up the walls and get inside the city. When these moves became known to the patrician Bonos, he too fitted out biremes and triremes, which he armed and stationed at the spot where the signal was to be given. He also drew up some biremes near the opposite shore and immediately directed them to light fires. The Slavs, upon seeing this, put out from the river called Barbasis and advanced upon the city, but the Roman ships moved out against them, and catching them in the middle, slaughtered them forthwith, so that the sea was dyed with much blood. Among the dead bodies one could observe even those of Slav women. When the barbarians beheld this, they gave up the siege and returned home. As for the archpriest of the city and Emperor Constantine, they proceeded to the church of the Mother of God at Blacani to offer unto God their prayers of thanksgiving, and straightway they erected a wall to protect that sacred church. So much then for the Avars. When Khosroes had been informed that Heraclius was close to the Persian royal residence, he sent out against him a brave and experienced general, named Rhazates. This man drew up his forces against the emperor, and coming forward in front of his lines, delivered a challenge to a duel. When Heraclius realized that none of his men would volunteer, he went forth himself against the barbarian. Being an expert archer, Rhazates discharged an arrow which grazed the emperor's lips. Then he shot a second arrow which scraped his ankle. Now Heraclius urged on his horse, and one of his bodyguards, who was ahead of him, sliced off with his sword the shoulder of Rhazates, and when the latter had fallen down, the emperor speared him, and straightway cut off his head. At the sight of this victory, the Roman army was filled with ardour. Perceiving the emperor's boldness, they moved energetically against the Persians, whom they utterly defeated and pursued, killing a great number of them. When the Persian noblemen became aware that the Roman emperor had made light of his own life for the sake of his state, they plotted with Khosroes' son, Cyrus, to slay Khosroes, insomuch as he had shown great neglect of his country. So they imprisoned him in one of his royal palaces, and gave him no food, but set before him a heap of gold and silver and precious stones, saying, "Do you enjoy these things, which you have loved insanely and amassed?" In this way they starved him to death, and proclaimed as king of Persia his son Cyrus. With a view to coming to terms, the latter immediately sent an embassy and gifts to Heraclius, and he wrote to him that their respective states should be reconciled and embrace peace at God's hands, so that each might live in tranquillity. Heraclius wrote back, calling Cyrus his son, and saying that it had never been his wish that a king, not even Chosroes, should lose his glory. Even though he had inflicted innumerable woes upon Romans and Persians, I would have hastened, he said, were he to have survived, to restore him to his own kingship, complete though my victory over him might have been. But God, knowing his purpose, has wreaked upon him a just punishment, so as to prevent universal destruction, and has now bestowed concord upon us. He also made a fervent plea concerning the Holy Cross, which Sabros had removed from Jerusalem. Saitos promised to deliver it if he was able to find it, and concerning the ambassadors whom Saitos had conducted to Chosroes by deceit, he said that Leontios had died a natural death, while the others Chosroes had killed by flogging, when he heard that Heraclius had invaded Persia. Soon thereafter, Syros died, and the Persian kingdom passed to Cabos, who also died after a short time. After him, Hormisdas became king of the Persians. He too treated with Heraclius, and sent to him his own son, along with a sum of money and precious gifts. He stated the following in his letter: "Just as you claim that your God was delivered into the arms of an old man called Simon, so I am delivering into your hands my son, who is your slave. May the God whom you worship watch how you treat him." Upon receiving him, Heraclius honoured him greatly, and when Hormisdas had died, he recognized him as king of Persia. Now Cerberus, when he had heard that Chosroes and Syros, Cabos and Hormisdas had all died, returned from the Roman country and wrote an apology to Heraclius, namely, that what he had done to the Romans was committed not of his own free will, but by order of his sovereign, and he begged permission to be received and to present himself like a slave. Upon receiving from the emperor a sworn assurance, he promised to appear before him and bring money from Persia, so as to repair whatever he had destroyed in the Roman country. At this juncture, the son of Hormisdas fell victim to a plot and was slain, and Cerberus requested from the emperor the Persian crown. The latter gave it to him, and they agreed among themselves that all the Roman territory occupied by the Persians should be restored to the Romans. When peace had been concluded, Cerberus immediately returned to the Romans both Egypt and all the eastern lands, after withdrawing the Persians that were there, and he sent to the emperor the life-giving cross. Now Heraclius conferred the dignity of patrician upon Nikephoros, the son of Cerberus, and gave the latter's daughter Nike in marriage to his own son, Theodosius, born of Martina. He also brought from Pentapolis Gregoria, daughter of Nikephoros, and wed her, whom he had already betrothed in her father's lifetime, to Constantine, emperor of the Romans. At about this time, the Saracens began to appear from Iphribos, as it is called, this being a country of Arabia the Blessed, and attempted to lay waste neighbouring villages. As for Heraclius, he directed that his daughter Eudokia should depart from Byzantium, insomuch as he had betrothed her to the lord of the Turks. But when it became known that the Turk had been slain, he ordered her to return. When Heraclius was in Persia, 2 of his sons and 2 of his daughters died. Taking the life-giving cross, which had remained under seal as it was when it was removed, he came to Jerusalem and exhibited it to the archpriest Modestus and his clergy, who acknowledged the seal to be intact. Seeing that the cross had been preserved untouched by the profane and murderous hands of the barbarians, and unseen by them, they offered to God a hymn of thanksgiving. The bishop produced the appropriate key, which had remained in his possession, and, when the cross was opened, everyone worshipped it. And after it had been elevated there, the emperor immediately sent it to Byzantium. Sergius, the archpriest of Byzantium, received it in procession at Blachernae, which is a church of the Mother of God, and after bringing it to the great church, he elevated it, This happened in the second indication. A short time thereafter, Heraclius too came to Byzantium, and was received by its inhabitants with great acclamation and exceeding honour. He brought 4 elephants, which he paraded at the hippodrome contests to the delight of the citizens, and celebrated several days of triumph, and distributed largesse to everyone. And since he had alienated some of the property of the great church, he commanded that an annual subsidy should be paid to it, and to its clergy. After this, he made arrangements for his son Constantine to assume the consulship, and appointed Heraclius, the son of Martina, as Caesar. After a short lapse of time, the Saracens overran the region around Antioch. Straightway Heraclius, together with his wife Martina and his son Heraclius, went forth to the eastern parts. When he arrived there, he became incensed at his brother Theodore, for it was rumoured in some quarters that the latter was railing at the emperor on account of Martina, and saying that his sin is continually before him. So he dispatched him to Byzantium, and instructed his son Constantine to have him dishonoured in front of a public assembly, and to hold him in prison. And he appointed commander of the eastern forces Theodore, surnamed Tritherios, the imperial treasurer. Now Sergius Carter Nicetan died in the following manner. The Saracens, having flayed a camel, enclosed him in the hide, and sewed it up. As the skin hardened, the man who was left inside also withered and perished in a painful manner. The charge against him was that he had persuaded Heraclius not to allow the Saracens to trade from the Roman country, and sent out of the Roman state the 30 pounds of gold which they normally received by way of commercial gain. And for this reason they began to lay waste the Roman land. On this account Heraclius ordered Theodore not to join battle with the Saracens, but his subordinate commander did not act according to the emperor's wishes, because he had rebellion in mind, and the men were induced to fight so as to overcome the enemy unexpectedly. They believed that victory would be on the side of the insurgents against the emperor, and so he joined battle with the Saracens at a place called Gabitha. But they, having set ambushes beforehand, and skirmished with a few men, advanced on the Romans. The ambushed men fell suddenly on the latter, and having surrounded them, slew many soldiers and officers. At the same time, Maria, the sister of Heraclius, sent money to the Khan of the Avars, and ransomed her son Stephen. Pleased with such gifts, the Avar chief urged Aninius, the magister, that he too should send gifts and ransom the other hostages he was holding, which indeed was done. At about the same time, Kubratos, the nephew of Organas and lord of the Onagundars, rose up against the Khan of the Avars, and, after abusing the army he had from the latter, drove them out of his land. He sent an embassy to Heraclius and concluded a peace treaty, which they observed until the end of their lives. Heraclius sent him gifts and honoured him with the title of patrician. While Heraclius was dwelling in the eastern parts, he appointed John of Barciana general of the army and sent him against the Saracens in Egypt. He joined battle with them, and was himself killed. Likewise, Marinos, commander of the Thracian contingents, engaged them in battle, and was defeated. He lost many soldiers, and himself barely escaped. In succession to him, Heraclius conferred the army command on Marianos, who held the Roman rank of Cubicularis, and dispatched him with instructions to consult with Kairos, archpriest of Alexandria, that they might take joint action with regard to the Saracens. Now Kairos had informed the emperor that he was going to conclude an agreement with Ambrose, Phylarch of the Saracens, and pay him tribute, which, he stated, he would raise by a commercial levy, while the imperial taxes would not be affected. He also recommended that the Augusta Eudokia, or another of the emperor's daughters, should be offered in marriage to Ambrose, with a view to his being consequently baptized in the holy bath and becoming a Christian. For Ambrose and his army had confidence in Kairos and regarded him with great affection. But Heraclius would not brook any of this. Since Marianus too was aware of these matters, he rejected the policy of Kairos, and having attacked the Saracens, fell in battle, as did many of his soldiers. At this time Heraclius returned home and resided in the palace called Hieria, for he was afraid of embarking on the sea, and remained unmoved by the noblemen and citizens who repeatedly begged him to enter the city. On feast days he would dispatch only his sons, who, after attending holy liturgy in the church, immediately returned to him. And likewise, when they watched the Hippodrome games, they went back to their father. While he was dwelling there, he was informed that his son, Atalaricos, and Theodore, who had the rank of magister, the son of Theodore the emperor's brother, together with some others, were about to plot against him. He was persuaded by the informants, and cut off the noses and hands of the conspirators. He exiled Atalaricos to the island called Principos, and Theodore to the island called Guadamelete, with instructions to the local commander to amputate also one of Theodore's legs upon his arrival. He punished in the same manner those who were privy to the conspiracy. After a considerable lapse of time, the noblemen of the court caused the prefect to collect a great many ships, and tie them one next to the other, so as to bridge the straits called Stenon, and to make on either side a hedge of branches and foliage, so that the emperor as he went by would not even catch sight of the sea. Indeed, this work went ahead speedily, and the emperor crossed the sea on horseback, as if it were dry land, to the shore of the Bay of Fidelia, as it is called. Avoiding the coastal area, he reached Byzantium by the bridge of the river Barbices. After this, he crowned Emperor the Caesar Heraclius. In the 12th indication, Sergius, Bishop of Byzantium, died. Since Heraclius was devoted to Pyrrhus, whom he called his brother, because when he was being baptized in the holy bath, the emperor's sister had received him in her arms, and knew him furthermore to have been on friendly terms with Sergius, whose quarters he had shared, he appointed this man archpriest of Byzantium. Some years previously he had recalled to Byzantium Kairos, the bishop of Alexandria, and held him under severe accusation of having surrendered to the Saracens the affairs of all of Egypt. He pursued these charges at the time in front of a large gathering of citizens, but Kairos defended himself by saying that he was in no way guilty of these matters, and that if his plan had gone forward, and he had raised taxes for the Saracens by means of trade profit, the latter would have remained in peace, and the imperial Jews would not have been in arrears. And he accused others of having committed the misdeeds in question, and alleged that he himself had made charges against them, but to no avail. But Heraclius called Kairos a pagan for having advised that the emperor's daughter should be betrothed to Ambrose, Phylarch of the Saracens, a pagan, an enemy of God, and an opponent of the Christians. Waxing incensed with him, and threatening him with death, Heraclius handed him over to the prefect of the city for punishment. After this, he thought fit that his son Heraclius should assume the consulship. He proclaimed Caesars his sons David and Martinos, and his daughters Augustina and Martina Augustus. Sometime later he fell ill with the dropsy and realized that his disease was difficult to cure, for it grew to such an extent that when he was about to urinate, he would place a board against his abdomen, otherwise his private parts turned around and discharged the urine into his face. This was in reproof of his transgression, namely his marriage to his own niece, on account of which he suffered the ultimate punishment. He set forth a testament whereby his sons Constantine and Heraclius were to be emperors of equal rank, and his wife Martina was to be honoured by them as mother and empress. So he died of this disease at the age of 66, after a reign of 30 years, 4 months, and 6 days. He was buried in the church of the all-praised apostles, and for 3 days, as he had ordained while he was still alive, the tomb containing his body remained uncovered, and attended by ministering eunuchs. After this, the Augusta Martina summoned the archpriest Pyrrhus and the dignitaries of the court, and having gathered the people of Byzantium in an assembly, showed the testament of Heraclius and the provisions he had made concerning herself and her children. All the people who were present clamoured for Emperors Constantine and Heraclius, so she brought them out, while expressing her claims that she, as empress, would have the first place in the empire. But some of the people present cried to her, "You have the honour due to the mother of the emperors, but they that of our emperors and lords. They paid particular respect to Constantine because, by reason of his seniority, he was first to have been appointed emperor when he was still a child. Nor can you, O lady," they said, "receive barbarian or other foreign emissaries who come to the palace, or hold converse with them. May God forbid that the Roman state should come to such a pass." And they came down from their seats, acclaiming the emperors. When Martina had heard these things, she withdrew to her palace. From this time, the empire was ruled by Constantine. Now Philagrios, who was imperial treasurer, informed him that his father, Heraclius, when he was ill, had provided money to the archpriest Pyrrhus on behalf of Empress Martina, so she would not be lacking in funds if she were driven out of the palace by her stepson, Emperor Constantine. The latter summoned Pyrrhus and inquired if that were so. Exposed by Philagrios, Pyrrhus surrendered the money, even against his will. Since Constantine was afflicted by a chronic illness, he dwelt for reasons of climate at Chalcedon, where he had built a palace. On seeing him in poor health and expecting him to die soon, Philagrios was afraid that Heraclius and Martina would do him harm. For this reason, he advised Constantine to write to the army that his death was approaching, and that they should assist his children and not suffer them to be wronged or ousted from the imperial office. Pleased by this advice, Constantine entrusted the letter and the conduct of the business to Valentinos, an adjutant of Philagrios, whom he dispatched to the army with a sum of money amounting to 2,016,000 solidi, and instructed him to persuade the enrolled soldiers that after Constantine's death they should oppose Martina and her children. After reigning 28 years together with his father and surviving another 103 days in the imperial office, Constantine died. After him, Heraclius was proclaimed emperor and shared the administration of the empire with his mother Martina. Straightway he dedicated to God in the sanctuary the crown of his father. This had been buried with him, but his son Constantine removed it from the church because it was valued at £70 of gold. He also reinstated Kyros, Bishop of Alexandria, in his own see. As for Philagrios, he had him tonsured and exiled him to a fortress called Septai, which lies towards the setting sun, opposite the Pillars of Hercules, on the side of Libya, and many others who happened to be friends and servants of Philagrios, he punished by scourging and other torments. Now Valentinos, the adjutant of Philagrios, when he heard these things, roused the soldiery against Martina and her children. He came with the army to Chalcedon, and remained there with a view to assisting Constantine's children. Heraclius held the city securely, and offered to all and sundry the justification that Constantine's son Heraclius remained unharmed. He showed him hail and sound to everybody, and protected him like his own child, which was confirmed by the fact that he had received him in his arms after his salutary baptism. In the presence of Pyrrhus, the archpriest of the city, he laid his hand on the life-giving cross and swore that Constantine's children would not be harmed either by him or anyone else. He also affirmed he would prove that Valentinos was plotting against them and reaching for the imperial office. In order to convince everyone even further, he took Heraclius along and crossed over to Valentinos, and was intending once again to swear and persuade the soldiers of his affection for Heraclius. Valentinos, however, did not receive him and sent him away, so he returned and told the story to the inhabitants of the city, who believed him and cursed Valentinos. When vintage time had come, the citizens saw that the army accompanying Valentinos was destroying their vineyards and not allowing them to cross thither, and so they urged Pyrrhus by their clamours that he should crown Constantine's son Heraclius. On beholding the disturbance and uprising of the people, Pyrrhus excused himself on the grounds that the insurrection had a different purpose, namely, to gain the imperial office for Valentinos, but as the mob was insisting, he laid the whole matter before the emperor. The latter, taking along his nephew Heraclius, proceeded to the church and mounted the ambo together with Pyrrhus, whom he invited to crown Heraclius, and as the crowd was pressing him to accomplish the deed, he took from the church the crown of his father, Heraclius, and performed the ceremony, and straightway the mob renamed the newly crowned one Constantine. Now the more ruffianly and boorish part of the people armed themselves against Pyrrhus and came to the church, but did not find him. So at the time of Vespers they entered the sanctuary, accompanied by a group of Jews and other unbelievers. They tore the altar cloth, shamefully defiled the holy spot, and, having seized the keys to the doors, affixed them to a pole, and so went around the city in lawless fashion. When Pyrrhus had been informed of this, he came to the church the following night, and, after embracing the sacred objects, took off his pallium, and placed it on the altar table, saying, "Without renouncing the priesthood, I abjure a disobedient people." So he went out quietly, and found a secret refuge with a pious woman. Then, seizing a favourable occasion, he sailed away to Carthage. When some of the monks there heard of his arrival, their leaders were Maximos and Theodosios, who dwelt in Africa. They interrogated him concerning the exposition made by the former Emperor Heraclius and by Sergius, archpriest of the city, regarding the two wills and energies of Christ our Saviour. So much for Pyrrhus. Now, since the followers of Valentinos were still at Chalcedon, Heraclius and Martina deemed it imperative, lest the estates in those parts suffer further damage, to come to an agreement with him, and compose their differences under oath. So they honoured him with the rank which the Romans call comes excubitorium, and promised that he would not be called to account for the moneys he had received from Constantine, that the soldiers who had joined him would be rewarded with gold, and that the Caesar David would be crowned and renamed Tiberios. When these things had been done, Paul, the former oikonomos of the great church, was appointed archpriest of Constantinople in October of the 15th indication. Then, after a reign of 27 years, Constantine was treacherously killed by his own servants in his bath in Sicily, and so ended his life. After him, his son Constantine was invested with the imperial office. Immediately after his accession, the leader of the Saracens built many ships, and sent them against Byzantium, under the command of Caleb, as he was called in their language, a man most loyal and experienced in war. On his arrival, he put in at a seaside suburb of Byzantium, called Hebdomon. When he became aware of his presence, Constantine too deployed a great fleet against him, Many naval battles were fought every day between the two sides, the engagements starting in the spring and continuing until autumn. When the bad weather came, the fleet of the Saracens crossed over to Cyzicus and wintered there, and in the beginning of spring returned thence, and continued in the same fashion the war on sea. So the war lasted 7 years, and finally the Saracen fleet met with no success. On the contrary, they lost many fighting men. Badly injured and grievously defeated, they set out on their homeward journey. And when they came to the region of Silion, they were overtaken by violent winds and a tempest at sea, which destroyed the entire armament. On hearing of the disaster of his fleet, the king of the Saracens sent ambassadors to Constantine with a view to concluding a treaty on payment of an annual tribute. The latter received them, and, after hearing their message, sent out in their company the patrician John, surnamed Pitzigordios, a man of outstanding experience and wisdom, that he might negotiate the peace. On his arrival in the country of the Saracens, he reached an agreement with them and confirmed by oath a peace treaty for 30 years, which stipulated that every year the Saracens would deliver to the Romans the sum of 3,000 pieces of gold, 50 captives, and 50 horses. When this news had reached the people that live in the west, namely, the chief of the Avars and the princes of neighbouring nations further west, they too sent ambassadors to the emperor bearing gifts and asking for peace. The emperor consented to this, and so peace and tranquillity prevailed in both east and west. So much for this. It is now time to speak of the dominion of the Huns, as they are called, and the Bulgarians, and their affairs. In the area of the Maeotic Lake, by the river Kofis, lies Great Bulgaria, as it was called in olden times. And here lived the so-called Kotagoi, who are also of the same stock as the Bulgarians. In the days of Constantine, who died in the west, a certain man by the name of Kobratos became master of these tribes. Called Byanos, in accordance with his father's command, has remained until this day in his ancestral land. The second, called Kotagos, crossed the river Tanias and dwelt opposite the first. The second, called Kotragos, crossed the river Tanias and dwelt opposite the first. The fourth went over the river Istros and settled in Pannonia, which is now under the Avars, becoming an ally of the local nation. The fifth established himself in the Pentapolis of Ravenna and became tributary to the Romans. The remaining third brother, called Asparach, crossed the rivers Danapris and Danastris and settled near the Istros, where he found a suitable place for habitation, called Onglos in their language, which happened to be difficult of access and impregnable by the foe, for it is secure in front because it is impassable and marshy, while at the back it is fenced by inaccessible cliffs. When this nation had thus divided and scattered, the tribe of the Khazars, issuing from the interior of the country called Bursila, where they had lived next to the Sarmatians, invaded with complete impunity all the places that are beyond the Euxine Sea. Among others, they subjected Byanos to paying tribute to them. When Constantine became aware that the nation that had settled by the Istros was attempting to devastate by its incursions the neighbouring places that were under Roman rule, he conveyed an army to Thrace and, furthermore, fitted out a fleet, and set out to ward off that nation. On seeing the multitude of cavalry and ships, and amazed as they were by the unexpected suddenness of the attack, the Bulgarians fled to their fortifications, and remained 4 days there. Since, however, the Romans were unable to engage them in battle because of the difficulty of the terrain, they regained strength and eagerness. Now the emperor was seized by an attack of gout, and being in much pain, sailed off to the city of Mesembria for treatment after giving orders to the officers and soldiers to keep on investing the fort and do whatever was necessary to oppose the nation. But a rumour spread about that the emperor had fled and, being on this account thrown into confusion, they fled headlong, although no one was on their heels. Seeing this, the Bulgarians pursued them in strength, killing those they caught and wounding many others, after crossing the Istros in the direction of Verona, which is near Odyssos, and perceiving how strong and secure was the inland area thanks to the river and the great difficulty of the terrain, they settled there. Furthermore, they subjugated the neighbouring Slavic tribes, some of which they directed to guard the area in the vicinity of the Avars, and others to watch the Roman border. So fortifying themselves and gaining in strength, they attempted to lay waste the villages and towns of Thrace. Seeing this, the emperor was obliged to treat with them and pay them tribute. The Roman Empire being thus at peace on all sides, the impious heresy of the Monothelites, which had begun in the days of the Emperor Heraclius, was gaining in strength, and a schism prevailed in the Catholic Church. On perceiving this, Constantine convened an ecumenical council, which confirmed the 5 preceding ecumenical synods, as well as the dogma of the 2 wills and 2 natural energies of our Lord Jesus Christ, whom it proclaimed perfect in his divinity and in his manhood, while condemning to anathema the leaders of the heresy. After thus spending the rest of his life in tranquillity and peace, he died in the 17th year of his reign. His body was laid down in the imperial sepulchres at the Church of the Holy Apostles. He left the empire to his son Justinian, who was then in his 16th year, and who, on assuming power, undid the measures which his father had taken for the sake of peace and the good order of the state. In addition to other things, he broke the peace they had concluded with the Bulgarians. He conveyed a force of cavalry to the Thracian region, and straightway advanced against the Slavs. Having pushed on as far as the city of Thessalonica, he captured many of the Slavic tribes that were there, some by war, others by treaty, and after conveying them by way of Abydos to the land of Opsicon, as it is called, he established them there. Among them he raised an army of 30,000, whom he equipped and named the Peculiar People, and placed under the command of one of their noblemen, called Nebulos. Putting his trust in them, he broke the peace that his father had concluded with the Saracens, and also dislodged the armed men who from olden times had been lurking in the mountains of Lebanon. He made an expedition against the Saracens, and came to Sebastiopolis. They too raised an army, and came to meet him, and they declared that they had in their possession the pledges of the peace treaty, but if the Romans wished to break them, God would judge the guilty. Since Justinian indicated his preference for battle, they affixed the written peace treaty to a tall standard, and ordered it to be carried forward. And so they advanced against the Romans, who turned to flight. The Peculiar People of the Slavs, as they had been called, joined the Saracens, along with whom they massacred the Romans, gaining as a result added courage. The Saracens caused greater damage to the Roman state. Thus it was with the Slavic nation. As for civil magistracies, he appointed to them men of a cruel and exceedingly harsh character, among them the eunuch, Stephen the Persian, treasurer of the imperial moneys, who inflicted many punishments, not only on those under his authority, but went so far in his insolence as to inflict lashes on Justinian's mother, as teachers do to children. And a certain monk, Theodotus, who had formerly been a recluse on the Thracian side of the Bosphorus, he appointed treasurer of public funds, or as ordinary folk say, general logothete. This man not only exacted money with exceeding cruelty from those placed under his power, whom he suspended by ropes and suffocated with smoking straw, but even confiscated the property of persons of high position, and put them to death by inflicting unbearable torments on them. Justinian also imprisoned for 3 years a certain patrician, Leontios, a native of Isauria, who had been commander of the Anatolic army, as it is called, and had often achieved success in war. Then he freed him from prison, and appointed him strategos of Hellas, forcing him to depart from Byzantium that very day. At a late hour of the night, his friends, a certain monk, Paul, of the monastery of Callistratos, who was an expert astronomer, and the monk Gregory, a Cappadocian by origin, who was abbot of the monastery of Florus, came to see him. On seeing them, he rebuked them, saying, "In vain have you predicted that I would become emperor, for now, as I depart hence, I shall be overtaken by a cruel death." But they dissuaded him from the journey by assuring him that he would attain power if he showed determination. Convinced by them, he assembled some of his servants, and taking up arms, it was still night, he went quietly to the Praetorium. On their announcing that the emperor had arrived to carry out his wishes there, the prefect of the Praetorium met them and opened the gates. Immediately they bound him hand and foot. Getting inside, Leontios released all the prisoners, whom he armed, and then rushed to the Forum, as it is called, and from there he ordered them to scatter throughout the city, and to loudly call to all Christians to assemble at the church of Sophia. Being thus roused, the entire multitude gathered in haste at the fountain of the church. Together with the monks and other friends of his, Leontios presented himself to Callinicos, who was then archpriest of the city, and forced him to come down, and cry to the people, "This is the day that the Lord hath made." The multitude, for its part, insulted Justinian. Thus they all proceeded to the hippodrome, and when it became day, Justinian was brought out to them. While the crowd was shouting that the emperor should be put to the sword, Leontios spared his life because of his affection for Justinian's father Constantine, and after cutting off his tongue and his nose, exiled him to the city of Kherson. By then he had reigned 10 years, and so Leontios was proclaimed emperor by the crowd. As for the eunuch Stephen and the monk Theodotus, even against the emperor's wish, they arrested them for the mistreatment they had suffered at their hands, and tying them up by their feet with ropes, dragged them to the market of the Bull, where they burned them alive. Such were the events at Constantinople. At that time Carthage in Africa, which had previously been subject to the Romans, passed under the dominion of the Saracens, who took it by war. On becoming aware of this, Leontios fitted out the entire Roman fleet, to whose command he appointed the patrician John, because of his experience in military matters, and sent him against the Saracens at Carthage. Arriving there, he routed in battle the Saracens who were in Carthage, and regained the city for the Romans. He also delivered from the dominion of that nation all the other towns that were there, left soldiers to guard them, and wintered in those parts. When the king of the Saracens had heard this, he mounted a stronger campaign against him, by which means he drove out John together with the Roman fleet, and reoccupied Carthage and all the towns round about. Setting sail, John was making his way back to the emperor, but when he reached the island of Crete, a rebellion broke out among his own officers and the mass of the soldiers, being as he was quite unwilling to return to the emperor in the grip of shame and fear. For this reason they insulted and repudiated Leontios, and elected a man called Apsimeros, whom they renamed Tiberios, the commander of the Caricioi contingent of the Kyberiot region, an office which the Romans are wont to call Drungarios. In the meantime, a plague fell upon the city and destroyed a multitude of men within 4 months. Having sailed up to Byzantium with the fleet that accompanied him, Apsimeros put in at Psyche, as it is called, a seaside spot opposite the city. For some time he joined battle with the inhabitants of the city, which he finally took by deceit after bribing the guards of the Blackani walls and their officers. The army that was with him entered and seized the moneys of the citizens. He arrested Leontios, who was then in the 3rd year of his reign, and after cutting off his nose, directed that he should live quietly in the monastery of Delmatos, as it is called. So much for them. As for Justinian, he was making, while he dwelt at Kherson, frequent declarations in public that he would regain the empire. Suspecting themselves to be in danger, the inhabitants of that city planned to kill him, or to deliver him prisoner to Apsimeros. On becoming aware of this, he escaped from that place and fled to the fortress called Doros, which lies in the country of the Goths. He requested leave to pay a visit to the chieftain of the Khazars, whom they call Khan. The latter consented, and received him with honour, and after becoming friendly with him, gave him his own sister, Theodora, in marriage. With the Khan's consent, he came to Phanagoria and dwelt there with her. When Apsimerios had been informed of these matters, he pressed the chieftain of the Khazars with repeated requests, promising him great sums of money and gifts if the latter delivered Justinian to him alive, or, if not, his head. The Khan yielded to the numerous requests, and promised to do so. He accordingly sent a band of men to guard Justinian, on the pretext that he should not fall victim to a plot by his fellow countrymen, but in reality, to make sure that he would not escape. He also gave orders to the chief of his tribesmen, who was on friendly terms with Justinian, and to the commander of the Scythian Bosphorus, to be in readiness for his order to kill him at the earliest opportunity. These matters were announced to Theodora by one of her father's servants, and she confided to her husband the details of the plot. So he invited his Khazar friend and, taking him aside, had him strangled, and in the same manner he killed the commander of the Bosphorus. Straight away he dispatched his wife Theodora to her father, and he himself deserted to a coastal spot called Tomis. There he boarded a boat, together with several men, and sailing by, came as far as Symbolon, close to the city of Kherson. Putting in at the harbour which is there, he sent one of his companions to the city to fetch Barabakurios, the latter's brother, Salibas, and a number of other men. Setting sail with them, he went past the so-called of Blackani, and demanded the inhabitants of the city to receive him as emperor, but they dismissed him with foul insults. However, he crept with a few men at night into the aqueduct of the city, and in this way captured Constantinople. For a short time he established himself in the palace of Blackani. He hanged on gibbets upon the walls Heraclios, the brother of Apsimerios, who was strategos of the Anatolic army, and the officers who were in the latter's retinue. He also apprehended Apsimeros, who had reigned 7 years, as well as Leontios, bound them with fetters, and kept them in prison. Thereafter he celebrated horse races, and had them thrown down at his feet, one on the right, the other on the left, and after treading on them for a short time, sent them to be beheaded at the so-called Kynegion. He showed many favours to the Bulgarian chief, Terbelis, who was encamped outside the Blackani wall, and finally sent for him, invested him with an imperial mantle, and proclaimed him Caesar. He had him sit by his side, and ordered the people to pay homage to them jointly, and after showering him with many gifts, sent him home. As for Callinicos, the archpriest of the city, who had cursed him at the proclamation of Leontios, he blinded him, and exiled him to Rome, and elevated to the priesthood in his stead one Kairos, who had been a hermit at Amistris, and had foretold him the circumstances of his second reign, when he was passing through those parts. He inflicted many deaths and injuries on his subjects. Some men he promoted to magistracies, and immediately sent emissaries after them to have them killed. Others he invited to dinner, and slew by deceit. Others he placed in sacks, and cast in the sea. In brief, he treated his subjects with great cruelty, and a savage disposition. At this juncture, he fetched from Caesarea his wife Theodora, and his son Tiberios, who was born to her, and invested them with the imperial crown. Thereafter he broke the peace with the Bulgarians, and after conveying a great army to Thrace by land and by sea, proceeded to the city of Anchialus with a view to fighting them. While his men scattered heedlessly to gather hay, the Bulgarians fell suddenly upon them, killing many of them, and taking many prisoner. Then for 3 days they besieged Justinian, who had remained in the city of Anchialus. Embarking on a ship at night, he fled from there, and returned to Byzantium. At this juncture the king of the Saracens sent a large army under the command of Malamas and Solomas, as they are called in their language, to besiege the city of Tyana. When they arrived there, they fought many encounters and threw down part of the walls by means of their siege engines, but they were unable to achieve any further successes, and were intending to return home. Thereupon Justinian sent emissaries into the interior, and after collecting a numerous body of peasants and farmers, ordered them to proceed to Tyana and relieve the besieged. On seeing them unarmed, the Saracens rushed against them, and some of them they put to the sword, while others they captured. Thus emboldened, they pursued the siege of Tyana, renouncing to do battle because of the lack of necessities, and deprived of the emperor's help. The inhabitants surrendered to the enemy under treaty, and departed to the country of the Saracens. On this account, the enemy gained complete freedom to devastate the Roman lands without fear, since no one was able to oppose them, so that a contingent of them, consisting of 30 men, advanced as far as Chrysopolis. This is a seaside settlement standing opposite Byzantium in the direction of the rising sun, massacred the local inhabitants, and then set fire to the ferry boats. Still remembering the denunciation made against him by the people of Kherson to Apsimeros, Justinian collected a large fleet of different ships and embarked in them as many as 100,000 men, recruited from the army registers, as well as among farmers and artisans, and from the Senate and the population of the city. He appointed a certain patrician Stephen, surnamed Asmictos, to command this fleet, and sent him out with orders to put to the sword all the people of Kherson and Bosphorus, and the other principalities, to install as governor of Kherson his bodyguard Helias, who embarked along with him, and to leave there in banishment the Armenian Bardanes. After crossing to those parts by way of the Pontic Sea, Stephen set about carrying out his orders, but spared a small group of children, allegedly as being captives. He made prisoner Tudunos, governor of Kherson, Zolos, who was styled first citizen, and another 40 distinguished men, whom he sent to Justinian with their wives and children, and another 7 prominent men of Kherson he affixed to wooden spits and roasted in the fire. He also placed in a boat and tied up as many as 20 men who administered the other towns, and, after filling the boat with a mass of stones, sank it in the sea. Now Justinian deemed, because of the consideration shown to the children, that Stephen had behaved more mercifully than he had been ordered, and directed him to return with all speed. Embarking from there in accordance with the command in the month of October, Stephen was overtaken by a violent storm, and suffered shipwreck. so that as many as 73,000 were drowned, and their bodies were cast up by the sea from the town of Amistris to Heraclea. Far from being distressed by these events, Justinian was overjoyed and decided to send another fleet there. On hearing this rumour, the dignitaries of those parts made themselves secure to the best of their ability, and sent ambassadors to the Khazars, asking them to send an army for their protection, to save those among them who had survived. When he had been informed of this, Justinian dispatched the patrician George and John the prefect of the city, together with other dignitaries, and 300 soldiers, to whom he handed Taudaunus and Zolios, so as to restore them to their former commands and bring Helias back to him. When these men had arrived at Kherson, the citizens allowed only George and the dignitaries accompanying him to enter the city, and when this had happened, they shut the gates on them and put George and John to the sword. As for the soldiers who had remained outside the walls, along with Taudaunus and Zolios, they delivered them to the Khazars who were encamped there, and sent them off to the Khan. Taking them along, the Khazars killed them on the way. Now the inhabitants of Kherson cursed Justinian with foul insults, and proclaimed as emperor Bardanes, who was in banishment there. When he had been informed of this, Justinian was all the more inflamed with anger. He killed the children of Helias, while their mother was holding them in her lap, and forced his wife to marry his own cook, who was an Indian and extremely ugly. Once again, he sent out another great fleet under the command of the patrician Moros, whom he ordered to destroy the city of Kherson, and to massacre without pity all of its inhabitants. Crossing to Kherson, he took his task in hand, but the city was saved by the sudden sortie of a Khazar army, and Bardanes escaped to the lord of the Khazars. Having failed in the siege, and being afraid of returning to Justinian, Moros made an accord with the city of Kherson. They abjured Justinian, and acclaimed Bardanes emperor, whom they renamed Philippikos. They then sent an embassy to the Khazar lord, asking Philippikos to be dispatched to them. The Khan imposed an oath on the Roman army concerning the safety of Bardanes, and exacted 1 nomisma from each man. As time went by, Justinian began to suspect that he had been rejected by them too. For this reason, he asked once again help from... After receiving them and crossing the Bosphorus with them, he ordered them to encamp in the plain of Demitras, as it is called, together with the army of Opsicon. He himself, taking along his dignitaries and another armed contingent, proceeded to the Pontic region as far as a seaside village called Ginglissos, with a view of finding out how things were going for him at Kherson. After spending some time there, he saw the fleet sailing down to Byzantium with Emperor Philippikos, and so returned to the army he had left at Demitris. Now Philippikos entered the city without a struggle, and immediately sent Helias with a band of soldiers against Justinian. This man gave a sworn pledge of safety to the army that accompanied Justinian, and promised a safe return to the Bulgarian host. He then cut off Justinian's head, the latter having completed 6 years in his second reign, and sent it to Philippikos, who received it, and dispatched it to the west as far as Rome. He sent out the patrician Moros and the imperial bodyguard John, surnamed Strauphos, against Justinian's son, Tiberios, whom they apprehended in the church of the most pure Mother of God, where he had taken refuge in the sanctuary. John rushed inside and dragged him away as he was clutching the holy table, without respect either for the sanctity or the tears of his grandmother Anastasia, who was present to share her grandchild's danger. They killed him with a knife like a senseless animal, at the so-called postern of the Kalinikoi of the wall that rises above, and ordered him to be buried in the church of the holy Anagroi in the quarter named after Paulina. Next day they arrested Barabakurios and Justinian's remaining dignitaries, and put them all to the sword. As for Philippikos, he appeared to administer the empire in an indecorous and negligent manner. In particular, he subjected to anathema the fathers of the Sixth Ecumenical Synod because he did not accept the two wills and energies of our Saviour that had been piously defined by them. In this he was supported by John, who was at the time archpriest of the city, Germanus, metropolitan of Kyzikos, as well as other priests and many senators. At this juncture, an armed Bulgarian band suddenly fell upon the inhabitants of the Thracian Bosphorus. They killed a great many people, both among the local population and among those who had crossed over from Byzantium for the sake of pleasure and recreation. Others they took captive and robbed of much silver and a considerable number of utensils. Taking advantage of the opportunity, they fanned out towards the land walls of the city and advanced as far as the so-called Golden Gate. On their return from there, they devastated many villages in Thrace. After this, the Saracen nation too raided the Roman country and, as they overran many regions, inflicted much damage on men and animals, and took Mysthia, as well as other townships. Now Philippikos, after celebrating the birthday of the city and putting on an equestrian contest, banqueted with his friends and lay to sleep at midday. At this juncture a plot was hatched against him. A certain George, surnamed Borifos, who was a patrician and commander of the Opsikian army, and happened at the time to be stationed in Thrace in order to guard the country because of the Bulgarian raid, sent at the instigation of the patrician Theodore, surnamed Myakios, one of his subordinates named Rufos, to Byzantium together with a few soldiers, so as to carry out the plot against Philippikos. This man broke suddenly into the palace, and finding the emperor asleep, woke him up, and brought him into the area of the hippodrome, where he blinded him, this being in the 2nd year of his reign. The next day, which was the feast of Pentecost, all the people of the city gathered in the church of the divine Logos, and proclaimed Emperor Artemios, who was a secretary of Philippikos, for such men are called a secretary in the Latin tongue, and renamed him Anastasius. A few days later they blinded the patrician Theodore as well as George. The latter they exiled to Thessalonica. Anastasius bestowed care on military affairs and appointed capable commanders to take charge of them. Having been informed that the king of the Saracens was intending to invade the Roman country, he sent to him the patrician Daniel, a native of the town of Sinope, who was at that time prefect of the imperial city, on the pretext of negotiating peace, but in reality to observe their preparations against the Romans. When this man had returned, he announced that the foreigners were about to launch a major attack on the Roman state with both horse and sea-borne armies. On hearing this, the emperor commanded that each inhabitant of the city could remain if he had provisions for a period of 3 years, but anyone who was not so provided should depart wherever he wished. He restored carefully the walls of the city, and refurbished the military engines. He also stored a great quantity of provisions in the city, and fortified it by such other means as befitted a hostile attack. When a rumour had spread that the Saracen fleet had come from Alexandria to Phoenix for the sake of cypress wood, suitable for shipping, he selected some fast vessels, on which he embarked an army from the region called Opsikion, and sent them to the island of Rhodes. He also arranged for other Roman ships to gather there. The command over them was given to John, a deacon of the great church, and inspector of public taxes, a prudent and experienced man who took charge of the whole fleet. When he had reached Rhodes and announced the orders that had been given to him, he found that all present were obedient and ready for the crossing, save only for those who had come from the Opsikian army, who were afraid of such a journey. The latter consequently revolted, cursed the Emperor Anastasius, and killed the Deacon John with a sword. Thereupon the fleet dispersed, each contingent returning home. Now the Opsikians, when they had come on their homeward journey to Adramyttion, found there a certain Theodosius, a collector of public taxes, an ordinary man uninvolved in politics, whom they urged to assume the imperial office. He ran away and hid on a mountain. But they pursued him, and proclaimed him emperor under pressure, and took him along. When Anastasius had been informed of these things, he left Byzantium, which he had previously fortified, and went to the city of Nicaea in Bithynia, where he made himself secure. As for the army accompanying Theodosius, they rounded up all the forces of Opsikion and many trading vessels, and came to the aforementioned coastal village of Chrysopolis. From there they launched every day an attack on the inhabitants of the city, and for 6 months the battle continued. When the fleet of Anastasius moved to the city harbour of Neorion, as it is called, the armada of Theodosius seized this opportunity to cross over to the Thracian side, which it occupied. After treasonably subverting certain persons, they took the city through the gate of Blackeni, and while it was night, broke into the houses of the citizens and inflicted heavy losses on them. Theodosius sent forth the dignitaries who were in the city along with Germanus, who was the archpriest of Constantinople, to give evidence of his deeds to Anastasius. On seeing them, the latter requested a promise that he would suffer no harm, and after donning the habit of a monk, presented himself to Theodosius, who exiled him to Thessalonica without any further injury. On account of the frequent assumptions of imperial power and the prevalence of usurpation, the affairs of the empire and of the city were being neglected and declined. Furthermore, education was being destroyed and military organisation crumbled. As a result, the enemy was able to overrun the Roman state with impunity and to cause much slaughter, abduction, and the capture of cities. For this reason also the Saracens advanced on the imperial city itself, sending forth by land an innumerable host of horse and foot, recruited from the various peoples subject to them, as well as a great fleet, numbering as many as 1,800 ships under the command of a certain Mazalmas. When the military and civic dignitaries became aware of these matters, taking account of Theodosius's lack of experience and his incapacity of offering resistance to the enemy, they pressed him with exhortation to abdicate the imperial office and assume without harm a private station. He accordingly withdrew after a reign of 1 year. Thereupon they held a ballot of who was to become emperor, and elected the patrician Leo, who was at that time strategos of the so-called Anatolic army. According to imperial custom, he was received in procession as he entered Byzantium through the Golden Gate, and having come to the great church, was invested with the imperial crown. The Saracen army, after destroying numerous Roman towns, reached the city of Pergamon and set about besieging it. They captured it for the following reasons. By some devilish intention, the inhabitants of the city took a pregnant girl who was about to give birth to her first child, cut her open, and having removed the infant from inside her, boiled it in a pot of water, in which the men who were preparing to fight the enemy dipped the sleeves of their right arms. For this reason, they were overtaken by divine wrath. Their hands became incapable of taking up weapons, and in the face of their inactivity, the enemy captured the city without resistance. Setting out from there, the Saracens proceeded to the Straits of Abydos, and crossed over to Thrace. After taking many towns there, they reached the imperial city. They threw a palisade around it, and began the siege. which they pursued for 13 months with the help of many kinds of engines which they had brought along. At this point there arrived a Saracen fleet under the command of Solomon. As they were sailing up the straits next to Byzantium, the ships that were guarding the rear, being heavily laden with a great number of soldiers and arms, met with a light contrary wind, and were forced back by the current, thus falling behind. On seeing them, the emperor embarked on biremes, and after breaking the enemy's line, burned 20 of their ships. The remainder of the Arab fleet, after sailing up the Thracian Bosphorus, put in at the harbour of Sosfion, and wintered there. That winter happened to be very severe, and so much snow fell that the ground was made invisible for 100 days. Consequently, the Arabs lost no small number of men, horses, camels, and other animals. When spring had come, another great Saracen fleet arrived from Egypt under the command of a general called Sophiam, and brought a large cargo of corn and weapons. A short time thereafter yet another fleet came up from Africa, laden with a mass of arms and provisions. Its leader was a Saracen named Iesidos. These fleets, it is said, for fear of being injured by the artificial fire of the Romans, avoided the straits of Byzantium, and landed on the Bithynian side, the first at the harbour called Kalos Argos, the second at the shore called Satyros. Now the Egyptian sailors entered at night the skiffs that were on their ships, came to Byzantium, and acclaimed the emperor. Taking courage at this, the emperor sent out fire-bearing ships against those fleets, and burned all of their vessels. They made much booty, and, after loading the weapons and provisions that were in them, came back to the emperor. At this time, the patrician Sergius, who was strategos of Sicily, along with the inhabitants of the west, gave up hope for Byzantium and the emperor himself on account of the enemy attack against them, and crowned their own emperor, one of the adjutants of Sergius, called Basil, the son of Gregory, surnamed Onomagulus, and renamed him Tiberius. On being informed of this, the emperor appointed the patrician Paul strategos of Sicily, insomuch as he was a faithful friend and experienced in military matters, and dispatched him to Sicily. When he had arrived there, Sergius fled to the Lombards. As for Paul, he gathered together the inhabitants of the island, and read to them the imperial letters. Being reassured by them, they acclaimed the emperor, and surrendered both Basil and the magistrates who had been appointed by him as prisoners to Paul. Taking hold of them, he executed a certain George and others, and sent their heads to the emperor, while the rest he punished with blows and torments, cut off the noses of some, and sent them into exile. After requesting an assurance of his safety, Sergius too was brought to Paul. As a consequence, the affairs of the West returned to peace and tranquillity. After this, a son was born to the emperor, whom he named Constantine, and on the 15th of the following month of August, the entire Saracen armament, both cavalry and fleet, withdrew from the imperial city. They lost many ships, which were overtaken by storm and violent winds, and many were dispersed among the islands as far as Cyprus, while others sank with their crews. Now Artemius, who had been banished to Thessalonica, attempted once again to win the empire by means of the following actions. He wrote to the patrician Sicinos, surnamed Rendakios, who was then dwelling in the land of the Bulgarians, whither he had been sent by the emperor with a view to concluding an alliance with them against the Saracens, asking him to assist him in his design and persuade the Bulgarians to cooperate with him. Sicinos promised to do so. Artemios also wrote to the magistrate Nikephoros, surnamed Xylinites, who was resident at Constantinople, as well as to the patrician Isoes, who was commander of the imperial Opsikion, as it is called, to Theokistos, who had been first imperial secretary at the time when he was emperor, and to Nicetas, surnamed Amphrax, commander of the walls, reminding them of their old friendship and urging them to assist him, open the city to him, and receive him as emperor. These letters were immediately revealed to the emperor, who arrested their recipients and punished them with blows, and they confessed. He cut off the heads of Nicetas, who had the dignity of magister, and of Theoktistos, while the others he chastised severely, confiscated their possessions, and sent them into exile. As for Artemios, he advanced as far as Heraclea with the patrician Sicinos and the Bulgarians, and they had with them the boats they had brought from Thessalonica, which they call Monoxyla. The emperor, however, wrote to the Bulgarians that they should embrace peace and surrender his enemies. They apologised and asked for his forgiveness, promising to bring about peace. Accordingly, they sent Artemios, along with the archpriest of Thessalonica, and many others as captives to the emperor. They also cut off the head of the patrician Sicinios, and sent it likewise, and so departed to their own country. Having gained possession of Artemios and the archpriest, the emperor beheaded them in the so-called Kynegion. He then performed an equestrian race, and paraded their heads affixed to poles through the hippodrome. All the other conspirators he chastised, cut off their noses, confiscated their possessions, and condemned them to banishment. After accomplishing these things, he invited the then archpriest Germanus, on the 25th of March of the third indication, which was the day of Christ's salutary resurrection, to the so-called tribunal of the 19 Couches, and crowned his son Constantine emperor. It is not proper to pass over in silence what occurred in those days near the islands called Thera and Thracia, which lie in the Cretan Sea. During the summer season, the watery deep happened to belch forth a quantity of smoky steam, out of which, as the air became thicker, a fire burst, and after the fire, an enormous mass of pumice-like stone was cast out, so that they formed a kind of island, and the land was joined to the so-called sacred island, which, they say, had also emerged from the deep in a similar manner, as is also reported of the aforementioned islands Thera and Thracia. The sea in those parts was everywhere covered by the immense quantity of stones that were thrown up, and they spread from there as far as Abydos and the coast of Asia. The adjacent water was so hot that one could not even touch it. The emperor, it is said, when he had heard of these things, considered them to be signs of divine wrath, and was pondering what cause might have brought them about. On this account, he took up a position contrary to the true faith, and planned the removal of the holy icons, mistakenly believing that the portent had occurred because they were set up and adored. He tried to expound his own doctrine to the people, while many men lamented the insult done to the church. For this reason, the inhabitants of Hellas and the Cyclades, disapproving as they did this impiety, rebelled against the emperor, and after collecting a great fleet, made a certain Cosmas their emperor. And so they came to the imperial city. The men of Constantinople joined battle with them, and set fire to many of their ships. Beholding their defeat, they went over to the emperor. One of their commanders, called Aglianos, when he had seen these things, despaired of his salvation, and cast himself in the deep water, wearing his armour. Cosmas and another man, called Stephen, were arrested and beheaded. The following summer, a numerous force of Saracen cavalry again overran the Roman state, led by Saracens called Amaros and Moias, they came to the chief city of Bithynia, namely Nicaea. After besieging it for some time, they finally departed without having accomplished anything. After this, the emperor convened to the palace a great throng of people from the city, and summoned Germanus, who was then the archpriest of Constantinople, whom he pressed to subscribe to the suppression of the holy icons. The latter declined to do so, and laid aside his priesthood, saying, "Without an ecumenical synod, I cannot make a written declaration of faith." Retiring thence to his ancestral house, he spent in it the remainder of his life. In succession to him, Anastasius, who was a cleric of the great church, was appointed archpriest. From that time onward, many pious men who would not accept the imperial doctrine suffered many punishments and tortures. While these things were being done, the emperor sent an embassy to the chief of the Khazar nation, and fetched the latter's daughter, whom he betrothed in marriage to his son Constantine. After a lapse of time, an earthquake occurred in Byzantium, and likewise shook violently other towns and regions. In addition to many other buildings, holy churches and porticos, which it caused to fall down at once, some of them being overturned from their very foundations. It also threw down the sacred church which bears the name of Saint Irene, and stands very close to the great church. Furthermore, the statue of Arcadius, the former Roman emperor, which stood on the hill called Zerolophus above the sculpted column, was cast from its height to the ground. The quakes continued for a whole year, for which reason many people went out of the city, and dwelt in huts outside the walls. After a reign of 24 years, Leo contracted a violent case of dropsy, and departed from this life, leaving his son Constantine heir to the empire. Now Artabazos, who was Constantine's brother-in-law, he was his sister's husband, together with his army, for he was commander of the Opsikian host, and his 2 sons, of whom one was called Nikephoros, and the other Nikephoros, was encamped in the plain of Dorylion, as it is called. Immediately on being informed of the death of his father-in-law, he planned an usurpation against Constantine, and he imposed an oath on the army under his command, that they would remain loyal to him, and not accept another emperor. As for Constantine, after he had acceded to the throne, he selected a contingent of soldiers, and went out of the city to the plain called Krassos, from where he sent a message to Artabazos that he was coming to join him, that they might confer regarding the enemy. The latter had already set out, not with a view to taking counsel, but in order to depose Constantine from the throne. When Constantine had been informed of the rebellion, and became aware that the patrician Bissar, who had gone forward to meet Artabazos, had fallen by the sword of his opponents, when he saw that the imperial camp was being looted, he fled to the country of the Anatolics, as it is called, and made himself safe. They received him favourably, and gave him a sworn undertaking that they would risk their lives on his behalf, while cursing Artabazos with foul insults. They also brought over the patrician Sicinios, and made an agreement with the army of the so-called Phrygians, which he commanded, and so altogether they set out against Artabazos. Now Theophanes, surnamed Monotios, who held the rank of magister, and was administering the emperor's affairs in Byzantium, gave his support to Artabazos, whom he proclaimed emperor, while informing the people of Byzantium that Constantine had died. He summoned his son Nikephoros, who was strategos in Thrace, and set him to guard the city with his army. As for the imperial servants, some of them he blinded, while others he maltreated in different ways, Straight away Artabazos arrived in the city with the army that accompanied him, and speedily restored the holy images of the saints. Marching in pursuit, Constantine reached Chrysopolis, as it is called. This is a port lying opposite Byzantium on the Asiatic shore. After remaining there for a short time, he returned, and wintered in the town called Armorion. The following year, Artabazos appointed one of his sons, Nikephoros, commander of the so-called army of the Armeniacs, while he crowned emperor his other son, Nikephoros. He also mounted an expedition against the country of the Asians, and cruelly devastated the villages that are there, whereupon Constantine attacked him and met him at Sardis, and having joined battle, routed him mightily, captured his army, and took possession of their baggage. Artabazos fled to the city of Cyzicus, and thence sailed off to Byzantium, while his son Nikephoros advanced on Constantine. The latter met him in battle near a place called Modrine, in the native dialect, routed Nikephoros, and killed many of his men. Under these circumstances, the Roman state was in extreme distress, insomuch as the struggle for power among those men aroused an internecine war among Christians. What terrible things are wont to happen in such conditions, so much so that human nature is neglected and made to oppose herself, not to say any more, is indeed known to many from experience. At this juncture, Constantine gained the upper hand, crossed over to Thrace, and laid siege to the city walls, while preventing the introduction of necessary supplies. For this reason the city was reduced to great distress, and a severe famine racked the inhabitants of Byzantium, so that many of them died, while others were forced to throw themselves over the walls. Some, indeed, bribed the guards of the gates to be allowed to leave the city in secret. Constantine received them all with favour, and treated them very well. Once again, Nikephoros undertook an expedition, and came as far as Chrysopolis, and again Constantine attacked him. Overtaking him at the city of Nicomedia, he captured him and put him in fetters, while he cut off the head of Marcellinos, archpriest of the metropolis of Gangra, who accompanied Nikephoros. Returning from there, he took Byzantium. Artabazos fled to the city of Nicaea in Bithynia, to whose inhabitants he alleged that he was going to recruit an army, and deploy a force round about. Taking a few soldiers from among them, he went off to the fort called Puzain, and shut himself up, but Constantine sent a detachment to pursue him, and apprehended him. Having brought him captive together with his sons, he paraded them at the Hippodrome Games, and then confined them to a well-guarded prison. A short time thereafter, the patrician Sicinius was also detected to have planned a rebellion against Constantine, and, after having been convicted, was blinded. Later on, Artabazos and his sons underwent the same penalty, while their accomplices in the plot were subjected to floggings and various other punishments, and condemned to exile. After making such disposition concerning his own rule, Constantine undertook a little later an expedition against the country of the Saracens, from whom he captured the city of Germanicia in the region of Euphratesia. Now a great plague fell upon the imperial city and the surrounding lands, and wherever this destructive disease prevailed, it consumed and entirely annihilated all human beings. Only those who fled as far away as possible from those parts were able to be saved, surely by God's will. The pestilence was particularly intense at Byzantium. Frightful portents were suddenly to be seen. Cruciform markings appeared on men's garments and holy clothes, upon doors and doorposts, and these phenomena aroused in every one great fear and consternation, as if they were foreshadowing an instant doom. Being out of their wits through terror and subject to hallucinations, men imagined that they were being accompanied by certain hideous strangers, whom they addressed as if these were known to them, and later recounted to others the words that had been spoken on the way. Others, terrified by phantasms, saw certain people striking one another with swords. And indeed, most of these visions were fulfilled. Nor were the survivors able to inter the bodies of the deceased and conduct the funerals. So few were they in carrying out so many burials. For which reason they invented a device, namely, to lay planks upon harnessed beasts of burden, and after making this construction very wide, they heaped upon it the corpses without decorum, and in whichever way. And as the beasts did not suffice, they used hand-borne wagons to carry out the multitude of the dead. The tombs gave out altogether, so that empty cisterns were filled with dead bodies. Fields were ploughed up, vineyards and orchards dug up, to serve the novel purpose of burying the immense number of bodies. As a result, most of the houses were completely shut up. The pestilence lasted for a year, after which time it gave way for the most part, and as in the beginning it had increased, so now it gradually abated. Those who were able to think aright judged that these misfortunes were inflicted by God's wrath, insomuch as the godless and impious ruler of the day, and those who concurred with his lawless purpose, dared to lay their hands on the holy images, to the disgrace of Christ's church. The city having consequently become almost deserted, Constantine populated it by transferring to it a multitude of people from the lands and the islands subject to the Romans. At the same time, he sent a fleet against the Saracen country, at whose head was the commander of the Kybariot army, as it is called. The fleet put in at the island of Cyprus. Straightway a Saracen armada from Alexandria arrived there too. Forewarned of this, the commander made a sudden attack, burned the enemy ships with fire, gained possession of all their equipment, and, after defeating them soundly, returned to Constantine. Thereafter a son was born to the emperor, whom he named Leo. At the same time, a severe earthquake occurred in Syria, causing enormous damage, for some cities that were there were completely destroyed, and the ground round about opened up to a great extent, while others suffered this fate but partially. Others were shifted from their high positions and slipped down entire, with their walls and houses, to the plains below, moving a distance of as much as 6 miles, more or less, from their original situation. Some affirmed that they had seen the ground in Mesopotamia, which is near Syria, crack deeply along a distance of 2 miles, and another ground, sandy and very white, thrown up from below, and that along with the latter was cast up a female mule, which proclaimed in a human voice the destruction of the Arabs. A short time thereafter a tribe appeared from the desert beyond, and slew many multitudes of Arabs without resistance. After these events, Constantine crowned his son Leo emperor, and straightway marched against the Saracens. He came to the town of Melitene, which he took by siege, and carried off from there a great number of captives, and much booty. At this time the Augusta Maria, his wife, died. So much for the spectacle of the stars. After some time, Anastasios, the archpriest of Byzantium, died. Now Constantine, who was completely determined to insult the church, and was by now making war on piety, driven as he was by the evil spirit that directed him, convened a council of 338 priests under the presidency of Theodosius, Archbishop of Ephesus, and appointed to be archpriest of the city a certain Constantine, who wore the monastic habit. and had been Bishop of Silion, they drew up a definition of the faith in which all of them, by an evil and impious agreement, set down a proclamation of the destruction of the holy icons. These they childishly anathematized in public, and, along with them, Germanos, who had been archpriest of Byzantium, George, a native of the island of Cyprus, and John of Damascus in Syria, surnamed Mansur. Having accomplished these matters, Constantine started building towns in Thrace, in which he settled Syrians and Armenians, whom he had transferred from Melitene and Theodosiopolis, and bountifully endowed with all necessities. When the Bulgarians saw these towns being founded, they demanded taxes from the emperor. On meeting with his refusal, they took up arms and overran the Thracian region nearby as far as the Long Wall. The emperor marched out against them, and having joined battle with them, put them to flight. He pursued them mightily and killed many Bulgarians. A short time thereafter he made an expedition against them by sea and land. Those who were embarked on the ships, which numbered 500, set sail by way of the Euxine and, upon reaching the river Istros, burned the Bulgarian lands and made many captives, while the emperor himself joined battle with them at the so-called Markali. This is a fort lying near to the Bulgarians, put them to flight, and killed many of them. Being thus worsted, they petitioned for peace, and delivered hostages from among their children. The following incident should also not be passed over in silence. In the autumn season, the weather became wintry, indeed cold and extremely harsh, to the extent of congealing the liquid element, a strange and extraordinary sight to those who beheld it then, and this not only in the case of fresh water, but even more amazingly, in overcoming the salty kind. The freezing occurred in many parts of the world, but was especially severe in the Hyperborean and northerly regions. So hard was the congealment that in the Euxine Sea, beyond the Pontus, this was frozen for about 100 miles from the shore, as well as the numerous great rivers that lie beyond. Furthermore, the coastal region that lies by Messambria and the city of Media was turned to rock by the cold, such coagulation extending to a depth of 30 cubits. In addition, an extraordinary amount of snow fell, so that the icy matter was piled up to a height of about another 20 cubits from the ground, and the sea became somehow conjoined with the land, so much so that one could not easily distinguish their respective boundaries. Thus, all the water having turned solid in the direction of the north, anyone who so wished could walk on it, and all those parts became passable, those bordering on the lands of the Khazars and the neighbouring Scythian nations, not only for men, but also for cattle and other animals. For this reason, too, the Pontic Sea ceased at the time to be navigable. After the passage of a few days, that immense mass of ice was fractured into several portions, which rose to such a great height that they seemed to be tall mountains. Some parts that broke off, driven by the force of the wind, drifted to Daphnusia, a very strong fort in the Pontic region, and moved down to the mouth of the Euxine. Compressed in the narrow passage that is there, they filled the intervening strait, and joined the continents on either side, namely Thrace and Asia, so that anyone who so wished was able to cross on foot rather than by ship from one to the other. Propelled from there, the ice spread as far as Abydos on the Propontis, which no longer looked like a sea. One part that broke off struck against the Acropolis of Byzantium and gave such a jolt to the wall that is there that those dwelling inside felt the quake. Dividing into three, the ice covered the shore on either side of the Acropolis. In height, it rose above the city walls. Over it some men were able to cross on foot from the Acropolis to the opposite shore, upon which stands the fort of Galatia, as it is called. These things caused great astonishment to the inhabitants of the city. Distressed by this strange and unexpected spectacle, they were seized by lamentation and weeping, and so went home. Several years later, some Slavic tribes left their own country and fled across the Euxine. Their number amounted to 208,000. They were settled by the river Artanus. As for the Bulgarian Huns, the following events took place. Coming to an agreement among themselves, they killed their hereditary lords, and appointed as their ruler one called Telesius, a haughty man, who yet exhibited the rashness of youth. This man gathered a band of armed fighters and overran vigorously the Roman villages and forts that were nearest to him. On seeing his insolent boldness, Constantine built as many as 800 horse-carrying ships and, after loading them with a force of cavalry, sent them by way of the Euxine to the Istros. He himself came to the city of Anchialus with another army. Telesius marched out against him with a great multitude of Slavic allies, but was defeated in battle and fled. Many of the belligerents fell on both sides, and a considerable number of prominent men were captured. Having thus won the war, Constantine returned to Byzantium and delivered to the citizens and to the members of the so-called colours the captives he had brought along, so that they would kill them with their own hands. Taking them outside the wall which lies on the landward side, they slew them. He exhibited their spoils, while they were watching the equestrian games. At the same time were displayed 2 golden basins that had been made in the island of Sicily, each one weighing 800 pounds of gold. Now the Bulgarians, seeing the bad fortune of Telesius, rose in revolt and killed him, and appointed as their lord one of their commanders, named Sabinus. Immediately on being invested with his authority, he sent an embassy to the emperor asking for a secure peace. This action did not please the Bulgarians, for in their distress they objected strenuously, thinking that they would be straightway enslaved by the Romans. Being in fear of them, Sabinus fled to the emperor. He sent a number of well-equipped men, and, having found their wives and kinsmen, who were in hiding, brought them to Sabinus. At this the Bulgarians changed their mind, and they too made overtures of peace to the emperor. The latter did not accept the proposals, and immediately took up arms against them. They, for their part, fortified the difficult passes of the mountain range that surrounds them. Upon receiving pledges from the emperor, their lords came before him together with his dignitaries. The emperor received them with Sabinus seated by his side, reproached them for their disorderly conduct, and the hatred they had shown to Sabinus, and agreed to make peace with them. These events took place in the first indication. Furthermore, a son was born to the emperor, whom he called Nikephoros. At the same time, a Saracen fleet set sail from Africa and came to the land of Sicily, but they failed in their purpose, because the army that was there opposed them bravely and repelled them. In the third indication, Constantine entered Bulgaria, in order to remove from office their leader, who had been appointed by Sabinus, a man called Ormeros, and proclaim in his stead the Bulgarian Toktos, brother of Byanus. The Bulgarians fled to the forests of the river island Istros, and many of them were slain, including Toktos together with his brother, as well as others. Another one of their commanders, whom they call Campaganos, was killed by his own slaves while he was attempting to escape to Varna and join the emperor. At that time, a great many Bulgarian villages were burned and destroyed by the Romans. The emperor's irreligion was by now freely expressed. Every avenue leading to piety was brought into discredit. The manner of life of the pious and those devoted to God was ridiculed and mocked. And in particular, the holy regime of monks was lawlessly persecuted. Those of them who had kept their profession had clung to their habit and had opposed the unholy doctrine of those men, were subjected to diverse tortures and different outrages. Some had their beards burned without pity, others had their hairs of their beards plucked out by force. They also broke the heads of some monks by striking them with the holy boards upon which were represented the images of saints. Indeed, they even gouged out their eyes and cruelly cut off other parts of the body, wretched men that they were. Every form of piety was, so to speak, rejected and driven away. And, as though a second paganism had grown up among Christians, all kinds of wicked devices were invented, whereby they sought to maltreat and injure those who had chosen to live according to God. Some of them they dragged down to the pit of their own perdition, those who yielded to the impious decree being driven by force, or seduced by deceit, or cheated by flattery, or beguiled by money, or honoured by imperial appointments and dignities, or who, having once swallowed the deceit through some of the multifarious devices of the devil, set their profession at naught, put off their decorous raiment, grew their hair instead of being tonsured, changed immediately into lay costume, and consented to have intercourse with women, and embrace marriage with them. These things were done so that the God of the universe should in every way be dishonoured, as far as this was possible to them, and the holy institutions of the Church insulted. For this reason, they apprehended a certain Stephen, a holy and God-loving man who wore a monk's habit, and was confined to a tiny cell situated below the summit of that great mountain, which is called the Hill of St. Oxentius. Unholy as they were, they brought against him a charge relating to religion, saying that he deceived many men by teaching them to despise the glory of this world, to disregard family and relatives, to avoid the imperial court, and to adopt the monastic life. On this account they inflicted many blows on him and condemned him to prison. Finally, tying a rope around his feet, they dragged him from the imperial palace to the so-called Market of the Bull, and broke him to pieces and, impious as they were, threw his body, as if he had been a criminal, in the so-called tomb of Pelagios, for it was customary to convey thither the bodies of unbaptized pagans, and of those who had died an illicit death. They brought under accusation many men invested with authority as well as members of the army, charging them with worshipping holy icons, and killed them as if they had been found guilty of sacrilege. Some they subjected to different kinds of death, on others they inflicted unusual punishments, while a great multitude were exiled. Furthermore, they resolved that all the subjects of the state should affirm under oath that henceforth none of them should worship the icon of a saint. It is even said by eyewitnesses that the then archpriest of the city elevated the life-giving cross, and swore that he, too, was not a worshipper of the holy icons. Such were the daring deeds of the impious. In the same year, Constantine made an expedition against Bulgaria, and came with his army very close to the Bulgarian land, where he encamped by the pass called Verigava. He also fitted out a fleet of about 2,600 vessels, which he manned with a multitude of sailors and soldiers, drawn both from the naval commands and from other regions, and sent them to the townships of Mesembria and Anchialos, in order to draw near to the Bulgarians. Upon seeing the multitude of cavalry and ships, the Bulgarians were distraught and begged the emperor for terms. But as the fleet was anchored by the coast of the sea that is there, for that place is lacking in harbours and difficult for sailors, a violent and harsh blast blew against it. It was a north wind, overturned and broke the ships against the shore, and sank in the surf a great number of the crews. The emperor was greatly distressed by this, and commanded the officers to cast nets into the sea, in order to collect the drowned bodies and bury them, and thus he returned to the palace. Still breathing hard against the pious faith, he insulted the sacred habit of the Nazarenes, for straightway he conducted hippodrome games, and directed that some of them should be dragged in the midst of the theatre, each holding a nun by the hand. After the throng of the spectators had poured upon them a mass of insults, and had spat upon them, as is the custom of the vulgar rabble, was this unlawful and most shameful procession completed. After this he falsely brought under grave accusation several men in high position and dignities, alleging that they were attempting to plot against his authority. Among these was Antiochus, who conveyed to him memoranda of public affairs; Theophylactos, who was patrician, and Strategos, in addition to some members of the imperial bodyguard, as well as a number of others. Shortly thereafter, he performed a similar contest and paraded them there as prisoners. The following day, he condemned to death the brothers Constantine and Strategios, and cut off their heads in the so-called Kynegion of the city, while others he blinded. And the next day, he contrived that some friends of Constantine, archpriest of the city, should concoct a sworn accusation against him, proving clearly that they had heard from him all the designs of the companions of Antiochus and Theophylactos. Straightway he exiled Constantine to Hieria. This is the name of an imperial palace that lies across the water from Byzantium in an easterly direction, and appointed as archpriest the eunuch Nikephoros, who was a presbyter of the Church of the Holy Apostles. All these events took place in the month of August of the fourth indication. Shortly thereafter, he had Constantine fetched, and sent him to the church, riding in a cart. He had him accompanied by one of the imperial secretaries, bearing the written charges against him. These the secretary read out before the gathered people, striking him on the face for every item of the accusation. In this way they brought him to the ambo and deposited him, while the new patriarch read out these same charges in front of the sanctuary in a low voice. The next day the emperor conducted the customary hippodrome games, and directed that Constantine should be pulled along, seated on a donkey, facing towards the rear of the animal, and should be cursed and spat upon by the whole people. Not long thereafter he commanded that his head should be cut off in the Kynegion of the city, and exposed aloft at the so-called Milion, while his body was dragged by a rope through the streets of the city, and cast into the tombs known as those of Pelagios. In the fifth indication there was a drought. The weather became parched and dry, so that even the aerial dew disappeared, and the flow of springs was interrupted. For this reason the baths remained idle, since the reservoirs were empty. Consequently, Constantine decided to renew the aqueduct which had been built by Emperor Valentinian, and had been destroyed by the Avars in the days of Emperor Heraclius. He collected from the Roman dominions a great number of artisans skilled in construction, on whom he lavished many allowances from the public treasury, and so completed this work. Avaricious as he was, Christ's enemy Constantine proved to be a new Midas, who stored away all of the gold. As a result, the taxed people, hard-pressed as they were by the exaction of imposts, sold cheaply the fruit and produce of the earth, so that 60 modi of wheat and 70 of barley could be bought for 1 nomisma, and many other goods were sold for very small sums. This was considered by the senseless as a sign of the earth's fertility and the abundance of commodities, but by the wise as a result of oppression and avarice, and as an inhuman sickness. In the 7th indication, a son was born to Constantine, whom he called Anthimos. At the same time, Nikephoros, the bishop of the city, restored certain structures of the cathedral church that had fallen into decay with the passage of time. He also scraped off the images of the Saviour and of the saints done in golden mosaic and in encaustic that were in the ceremonial halls that stand there. These are called Sia Eta by the Romans, both in the small one and in the big one. As for Constantine, he sent emissaries to the chieftains of the Slavs, and ransomed in exchange for silken vestments the Christian captives they had taken a long time previously on the islands of Imbros, Tenedos, and Samothrace, to the number of 2,500. After bringing them in his presence and giving them some small rewards, he let each man go wherever he wished. In the month of April of the 7th indication, on Holy Saturday, Constantine crowned his wife Eudoxia as Augusta, and the next day he made 2 of his sons Caesars, namely Christopher and Nikephoros, and the third, Nikephoros, he made Nobilissimus. In the course of the customary imperial procession to the cathedral church, they gave largesse and distributed money to passers-by, starting at the palace and continuing to do so as far as the church. In the 8th indication, Constantine brought from Hellas a wife for his son Leo, namely Irene, and in the month of December he crowned her Augusta, and after uniting her with his son, celebrated their wedding.